itself, because it was closed, but it was used by a group of these brothels for the girls to go and take rest stops once a month. There was organization. The syndicate was real, and obviously was playing full time. Guy who actually owned the Ethel Inn was a guy named Splone, and Michael Splone, and he was a car dealer, loved fast cars, and especially loved to take trips up to the Wilkes-Barre area, where apparently he picked up girls who were starting their career and ferried them down, and then would ferry people back for the weekend or whatever. He was the transport operator, and again, not just for one place, but for a group of places. The operation was organizing. Now let's finish out the story with Buckles and his gang. Obviously the gunpoint holdups weren't working, so he decided apparently to try something different. The press reported that he was out of town, but a series of bombings took place in 1929. 9 of them, actually, in the first half of the year, as shakedowns, apparently, for these brothels. The Bushkill Inn up by Tatamy, which we talked about, was the remodeled Blue Moon, and it was only in operation 10 days before a drive-by stick bombing blew out the front of it, injured several people, and they ended up having to close. Miraculously, the bombings stopped in the summer of 1929. Why? What happened? Well, it turned out that in August of 1929, the bullet-ridden body of Buckles was found in a ditch in New Jersey. Remembering, they never killed Tony Testa, who after all was the bomb maker, so probably was the guy doing the actual manufacturing, but the head of the gang, Buckles, was now gone, and the word was out that the syndicate was in operation and successful. The entrepreneurial nature of the business was now obviously gone, and you needed to join the syndicate maybe to protect from a little bit from the police, but mostly to protect from other gangsters. 1929 was also the year when a guy named Harry Malaga and his girlfriend, Elizabeth Martin, who was popularly known as Betty the Blonde, was caught transporting stuff, contraband, to Boston. He was caught by federal agents in Boston, and he decided that the best way out of the jam he was in was to sing. And he did. Not only to the FBI, but also to the press. And he insisted that there was a huge syndicate centered on Easton that serviced not just the Easton area, but the entire East Coast, down as far as Charleston. And of course, Boston. It was in operation and rotated the girls. Now we know they were rotating girls. We saw them at the Ethel Inn, right? But he insisted that they were rotating them not just locally, but in a huge chain through the eastern United States. We have no corroboration of this. He claimed that the head of the gang was a guy popularly known as Cockeye, who'd committed 40 murders and so on. It looks like Mr. Malaga may have elaborated the truth just a little bit, and Cockeye was never found. But there obviously was something in it, that there was an organization. It did rotate girls. It rotated them back home as required in Spalone's car, and something was going on, and it could be that they were spreading their tentacles a little bit broader. However, the public ate this up, and Easton got a huge reputation. Of course, this didn't hurt the bus trips from Madison Square Garden and all the rest of it. Publicity is a great thing for a consumer business, after all. The time was coming, however, it was all too good to be true, and the time was coming when the boom was going to get lowered. There was an incident in Easton where several officers arrested people for running a brothel and selling alcohol. They went to the grand jury. The grand jury contemptuously rejected the charges, refused to return an indictment, and instead fined the officers for daring to arrest these people and insisted that the officers pay the fine personally. I mean, you can't get much more message than that, right? An attorney named Herbert Laub took up the case for the officers, and he did ultimately get the thing remitted to allow the employer, the town, or the county, actually, I believe they were county officers, to pay the fines that they didn't have to pay them personally. Laub, based on the publicity surrounding this case, then ran for district attorney and on a cleanup campaign said that he would stop the business. He was elected. There was a lot of contest about election fraud, about his election. However, one way and another, he got in. He hired as his head county detective the head of the Easton police, a guy named Herman Mendikheim, who, after all, had been running the police in Easton. So something seems a little odd there, since Easton had been the center of the wide-open goings-ons, right? How wide open was it? Well, let's drop back and take a look at it. And to do that, I want to look at one notable personality on Pine Street, a lady by the name of Moetta Newhart. Now, some of you know the name. Moetta was popularly billed as the head of the prostitution business in Pine Street area, a syndicate, which she had built up. You had to get permission from Moetta to do tradesman work or anything. You had in any of the houses along that 500 block of Pine Street. You needed to go to Moetta and get vetted and be allowed to do it. She had a couple of houses herself that she owned, either herself or through proxies, or she did apparently marry a guy named Rex. And it was difficult for me to get that information, to verify that information. I had heard stories about him, but it was finally verified, and the library, interestingly enough, has found evidence that the marriage may have taken place in Niagara Falls. So, which is why we couldn't find evidence of it here. But Moetta was an outgoing figure, apparently a small lady, but had flaming red hair, an outgoing personality, had absolutely no qualms about what she was doing. One story, they were doing a token perp walk of the prostitutes that had been arrested, and Moetta always came and bailed them out. Of course, they disappeared and the bail was forfeited. And Moetta stormed into the perp walk at about the time when the girls were being asked, for the record, what was their profession, and the girl said, well, I'm a model. But it was probably true, because many of them during the day worked in the department stores that were centered in Easton on Northampton Street. And they were lovely girls, many of them, and where better to get somebody to model the clothes. So probably true, but Moetta stormed in and shut the girl up and said she's a whore, and proud of it. Moetta was arrested repeatedly and either acquitted or given a small fine. In 1929, she actually was arrested, went to trial, and was sentenced. Partly, she had pleaded that she was leaving town and they ought to let her go on that account. She was going to move up to Stroudsburg, where incidentally Mr. Rex had his home. And, but She never did actually move to Stroudsburg, although she made variations of her name in the city directory. She changed 1 or 2 letters in her last name so that she was difficult to find. But evidently the part of the problem was that she had been put on the stand to testify, and on cross-examination, the prosecutor had asked her if it wasn't true that even though she was going to Stroudsburg now, that she'd kept brothels. And she said, well, of course, everybody knows that. Her lawyer appealed the conviction on the grounds that this was reputation evidence, and the appellate court had no problem in coming down with a decision that this was not reputation evidence, this was a confession. There was no problem in relying on it, and she would go to jail. The lawyer was not done, though. Moetta had only served a couple of months when he went back with a petition that her sentence be commuted because she had stood bail for all of the prostitutes who had jumped bail, and therefore she owed a lot of money to the town, and she couldn't pay if she was in jail. She had to get out to run her trade, which she didn't specify, of course, in the papers. And the I'm sorry, it was parole. And the parole board bought it. They thought this was a good excuse, and they turned Moetta loose. Laub, when he came into office in 1931, conducted raids. They were well-publicized raids. They were sort of like Elliot Ness things, you know, where the cops go in and bust up the kegs and the press is there taking pictures and so forth. All good publicity. He later told people that the raids had very little to do with busting up the trade. What he really did was he went down to Center Square because a lot of the buses, the taxis, the people from out of town didn't know where Pine Street or the roadhouses were located, and a trade had developed at Center Square for runners who would direct traffic to the various brothels. One interesting character there was a guy named Six-Fingered Bruneo, Six-Fingered Sam. Sam actually had hexadactyly, and he had one of the fingers, the excess fingers on his right hand cut off, but the left hand still had the 6 fingers, so he was very recognizable. He worked for Moetta. Laub simply broke up the Center Square runners, the guys who were doing all the getting tips for taking people to the brothels, so the folks from out of town didn't know where to go. And that effectively broke up the roadhouse thing. But Laub and Menikheim had a policy that they would only enforce the prohibition laws and the anti-brothel laws in the county and not in the cities, because the cities had their own police forces. The cities being specifically Bethlehem and Easton. Now, Bethlehem had pretty well cleaned up their act after the murder of the cop, but Easton, as we know, was wide open and had been wide open under Menikheim's jurisdiction. So Laub effectively cleaned up all the competition from Moetta and funneled all the business to Pine Street, so that Moetta had developed a virtual monopoly on the trade, and he did nothing about that. And with the former Easton police chief as his head of detectives, you can see how that policy was enforced. So, although you don't like to say it, Spallone is actually was heard saying that Laub was a bit of a fraud because what he was really doing was cleaning competition out and directing traffic to one source within Easton, within easy reach of Center Square. Now, the business remained in operation during the 1930s. Prohibition, as we know, came to an end in 1933 with the election of the Democrats and big fanfare. All 3 breweries reopened in Easton, but 2 of them shut down again promptly within the 1930s. Sites had problems over legal problems because they were not paying their federal taxes, and they were doing phony, there were seals that were supposed to go on the bottles, and they were buying phony seals. The Bushkill Brewery just kind of couldn't get a market going again, and because during Prohibition there had been a focus of the nation's taste onto lager beers, and all of the variations just didn't seem to be able to make it. The Kuglers stayed in business. They stayed in business till the early 50s, but it was a shadow of its former self. And this was true throughout the nation. As we got to, and I'm jumping past quickly, just to complete the story, as we jumped to World War II, a lot of the folks who would be drinking the beer and the booze, of course, became soldiers. And the feds supplied it, supplied the stuff to the soldiers, but they wanted a reduced number of suppliers and a reduced choice. They wanted control, and they wanted a few massive suppliers to supply the government offices and PXs and what have you, and that's what they got. So the number of brewers from 2000 at the turn of the century was reduced drastically to several hundred after World War II. The trend continued as the public's taste was focused more and more on Budweiser, basically. By the 1980s, one report said that there were only 100 brewers left in the country from the 2000 that had been. Another report said there were only 45 that were truly independent. Of course, the 1980s started to develop the craft brewing trade. The public's taste was reignited in different flavors of beer. The brewing industry, and especially the craft brewing industry, began to take off in the 80s, the 90s, and has now, by the turn of the 21st century, headed back in the direction and just about reached the same number of brewers that there were at the turn of the 20th century. It was a lost century for the business, basically, but maybe we're back to square one and we can start over, do it right this time. Now, we're running, I think I probably am exceeding my time. I'm not sure my watch is off, but let's just look a little bit. Yeah, I'm getting the symbol. So let's just look very quickly at the subsequent history of some of these people. Herbert Laub became a judge. He became a judge who got the final case as World War II loomed. The feds went in and rather pointedly sat in on the alcohol and brothel trials, frankly intimidating witnesses and intimidating juries, because World War II required, they thought, that they get control over the country. So in 1942 and 1943 you had convictions. Moetta was finally convicted in a meaningful way, appealed to the appellate level court. Herbert Laub sat on that case and said that he was well familiar with Moetta, and he wasn't going to hear anything that she had to say, basically, and sent her to jail. She spent a brief time in the mental institution in Allentown, and then was released by that and spent a couple of years in jail. She went back, rented a building, probably owned it through proxies, on Northampton Street, just around the corner from Pine Street. The brothel trade did continue in the 1940s after World War II and into the 50s. Pine Street still apparently was controlled by Moetta. You had to get permission to do work in that area from her. 2 years after she moved into Northampton Street, a guy named Heckman, Sterling Heckman, moved into her building. They became very friendly. He moved in 1951. By a couple years later, he made his will in favor of Moetta, who was billing herself under various creative names in the directory. they became a couple, and she was listed then as Moetta Heckman. He died in 1965. She became his widow. There's no evidence that they actually married, but that's the way she basically went through the rest of her life. She died in the 1970s, a grand old lady, and she was buried in Easton Heights, which I understand is now being taken over by Easton Cemetery. She had her own grave. Interestingly enough, the official records of the cemetery listed her as Moetta Rex, as did the Social Security Index, but the gravestone has her name listed as Moetta Heckman, and it's very close to where the gentleman was buried. Herbert Lau was defeated for office when the Democratic Party decided that it was going to flex its muscle, the local